Welcome to Psyched Up, Emotional Fitness Programming. I'm Ron Curtis Jr., Media Director for Emotional Education Services, the producers of this program. Psyched Up features the EMOed system, short for Emotional Education. It's the system that provides us with strategies for emotional fitness. This edition of Psyched Up is entitled Managing Anger. When it comes to anger, we do have a number of options outside of simply working ourselves into a fury, becoming enraged, and throwing a temper tantrum. In this program, we'll discover what some of the more effective anger options are and how to use them to our advantage. And we'll learn them from the creator of the EMOed system, Dr. Mary McLaughlin. Well, Mary, anger, of course, is something we all experience. But when I told people I know that we were going to do a program on anger, they said, oh, is it going to be one of these touchy-feely, hey, don't let it get to you kind of programs? Well, is it?
Well, no, because there are few things in life that get to us with the intensity of anger. It's just a really arousing emotion. And, you know, if we just suck it up like a vacuum cleaner, which is what our culture sometimes seems to suggest, we're eventually going to build up a lot of pressure to the point where we either explode or even implode.
Now, Mary, I know what you mean by explode, but what do you mean by implode?
Well, we're all familiar with the old stereotype about the person who comes home from work in a bad mood after a bad day at the office. And this individual will yell at the children or throw the newspaper at the dog. This is the kind of person who takes anger out on other people, oftentimes people who don't have anything to do with the initial event, as in this case. They direct it outward. The implosive individual kind of directs all of the energy, the angry energy, towards himself or herself. And they do things like go home and get drunk, or overeat, like eat a whole gallon of ice cream, or they do other substances, or they lie in bed all day and they get depressed and they call in sick. None of these strategies is useful or effective in managing anger.
As a matter of fact, they sound very self-destructive.
They are destructive. They make the situation worse, generally. What we need to do is we need to learn to discipline ourselves to manage our anger. If we can learn to manage it, we can learn to use it to our advantage.
Now, are you saying then that it's okay to feel angry?
Oh, yes, yes. And sometimes, you know, sometimes the only appropriate response to something is anger. Sometimes things are so outrageous that the only sensible response is anger. But, you know, implying to someone that they shouldn't get angry is kind of like saying that they shouldn't get hot or they shouldn't get cold. You know, it just is. The critical point with anger is when we decide what to do afterwards. You know, if you're cold, you go and put on a sweater. You don't go break the window. You know, you do something to solve the problem. We have to learn to act and not to react. We have to learn to manage anger so that it doesn't manage us.
Remember, anger is a natural and spontaneous emotion. It's not just feeling angry that can get us into trouble. It's how we choose to think about a provocation and subsequently how we choose to behave that can be detrimental to ourselves or to others. In trying circumstances, we can learn to act and not simply react.
Now, Mary, would these strategies work for the person with a so-called bad temper?
Oh, yes, definitely. A lot of what a bad temper is letting a lot of smaller things build up to the point where finally some straw breaks the camel's back and the person explodes. It's better to handle each individual provocation as it arises and to not let things build up in that manner. You know, having a big reaction like that is kind of like the equivalent of throwing fuel on a fire. It really just makes the situation worse. It makes the controversy more inflamed. It's like shooting ourselves in the foot. We have to learn to act and not react.
Well, I would think that anger would be the quintessential reaction emotion.
It is. It is, but it's a very, very complex emotion. You know, there are a lot of people for whom the anger stems not so much from some individual thing that happened, but from a deep-seated resentment, a resentment sometimes related to years ago when they were children and treated badly. This is your person with a big chip on his or her shoulder, and they oftentimes they go looking for something to get angry about. It almost doesn't matter what you do.
So it's kind of like the mad at the world kind of person.
Definitely. You know, I spoke with a person like this this week, as a matter of fact, in my office, and he told me that he had committed a homicide when he was 17 years of age. He was a very, very angry young man, and he said that he had had a terrible situation in his family growing up. He was very, very resentful of it, and he was mad at the world, and he set out as a youngster to settle the score with the world. And he even told me that he didn't even care if he ever lived to become an adult.
So there was something, though, he could have done with all this rage and resentment.
Yes, yes. Oh, yes, something much better, something constructive he could have. You know, what he chose to do was, he chose to be very destructive, but anger has a great deal of energy attached to it. It has an enormous amount of energy attached to it. It's almost like a waterfall, which has a huge amount of energy. And if we can harness that energy, we can do something constructive with it.
So you mean, Mary, that anger can be used as a resource?
Oh, definitely. You know, ironically, in the story which I just told you, this man had a brother who was very close in age. So the two of them went through the same circumstance, they were very adverse circumstances. And they both experienced it. And they both ended up in foster care at a very young age. But whereas the first brother ran away from the foster home at age 13 and went on to a life of rampage and violent crime, the second brother chose to stay there. And ultimately, the foster family put him through college. And at this moment, as we sit here, he lives in that foster house because eventually the foster parents died and they left it to him in their will. So he used the energy to do something constructive rather than something destructive in his life.
But the first man that you talked about has turned things around.
He has turned things around, actually belatedly, but in a very big way. He's in his 40s now. He has served his time. You know, he was only 17 when he was convicted. And now he has a wife, he has 2 children, he has a lot of property and a number of animals and a good job. And what he invests his energy into now, he's determined now. He's just determined to give his children a better life than he has. And when you talk with him, he speaks a great deal about that. He's very involved in their education and in their lives. So he has ultimately started to use his energy for constructive purposes, but he's lost a lot of years, as he says himself.
So then, even if we don't start out using the angry energy to our advantage, it's never too late.
No, it's never too late. And I have another story I want to tell you, which illustrates how we can harness the anger to our advantage and to construct something with it. I spoke with a man, within the past week, and he told me a story that also happened when he was 17 years of age. And he applied for a job for which he was pretty qualified. And he went to the interview, and it went extremely well. This was many years ago. And the interviewer flipped to the last page of the application wherein some personal questions were asked. Some of them, of course, would be illegal today. One of them was, what was his religion? And he saw the interviewer looking at that section of the application, and he was Jewish. And the interviewer read that and immediately terminated the interview. He stood up very abruptly and said they didn't need any help and walked out of the room. Well, this man was just devastated, and he eventually found his way out of the building, and he went across the street to a public park, and he literally sat down there and cried in broad daylight. He just sat and cried. He was overwhelmed with what had just happened. And he said to himself, I will never work for anyone else again. I will never put myself in that position again. And he used that, actually he's in his 70s now, and he built an enormous commercial real estate empire in the Northeast. And, you know, he didn't have to work for anyone else throughout his entire career.
But nonetheless, I'm sure it wasn't the last time he experienced anti-Semitism.
It wasn't the first time either. There was a lot of anti-Semitism which he experienced in his life. He still says he experiences it. And this tells us a lot. Describes a characteristic of anger that we often overlook. Many times, very often, the provocations go on and on and on. They go on for years, same old thing, whether it's anti-Semitism or racism, sexism, ageism, whatever. The situations tend to recur, and sometimes they even get worse. And a lot of anger arises within relationships, too. And again, they go on over and over again because we're still related to the people. We oftentimes can have problems with our children, with our spouse, our parents.
Sure, and your parents are always your parents, and your kids are always going to be your kids, and you might be stuck in a job for years where the boss doesn't change.
They're going to be around for a long time, maybe forever in our lives. And we have to learn effective ways to manage our anger, again, so that we learn to act and not react.
Anger comes with an enormous amount of energy associated with it. This energy can be applied in a constructive rather than in a destructive manner. The choice is ours. Be assured, it is never too late to start using our anger constructively.
Well, Mary, you have an incredible story that put the EMOed skills to a long test in your own life. Tell us about that.
Well, yes. The story of the divorce that I went through is one of these stories that goes on for many years and has many, many chapters to it.
Now, how long were you married?
By the time I was finally divorced, I was married for 20 years.
Mm-hmm. And when did things go bad? There's one particular story I know that was outrageous.
Well, the first thing that happened was we were in year 16, and my husband came home from work at 3 o'clock one afternoon, very unexpectedly, and he told me that he had taken an apartment and he was going to move there. And of course I was really stunned at this, but I handled it really well, and I thought, you know, we had had a lot of problems for a long time, and I thought maybe this will help us. I tried to take a constructive view of it. Maybe it will help to be separated from have a little distance between us. Maybe we can work out our problems then. And I went along with it. And when he left, he said to me, I said, well, how will I get in touch with you? And he said that he had a telephone, but that he didn't want to give me the number because he didn't want me to be calling him, and that I should call him at his office. Well, this is where I started to work myself up, because I had called his office before, and the secretary he had at the time was a very unpleasant individual. I had never met her in person, but she was always very abrupt and brusque with me. And this was when things were going well. So I really didn't want to be put into the position of having to call his office and deal with her when we were separated, because, you know, secretaries always, they know what's going on. But nevertheless, this was what he wanted. So there came a time when I did call there. And indeed, she answered the phone, and she said that he was very busy, couldn't come to the phone, said it in a very abrupt and short manner, and then said, would I please leave a detailed message which she would deliver to him later? Well, I wasn't going to leave a detailed message about what was going on, you know, with us.
Sure.
And so I hung up, and I said, well, I'll call back later. But as I thought about it, I thought, I'm not going to do that again. I don't deserve that. I am his wife. I'm the mother of his child. I don't deserve to be put through that process of having to deal with that secretary to get a message to him. And I wasn't going to be subjected to that indignity. I thought it was too much. And so I didn't call him back. And eventually he showed up and said he hadn't heard from me, and I told him why. And I said, I'm not willing to talk to your secretary. I'm not willing to communicate with you in this manner. And I don't deserve this. I'm not willing to lower myself to this level, to be put through this filter. And I won't do it. And I said, if you want to communicate with me, I would like you to find some other means. I said, I will not call you that way, no matter what happens. If the house burns down, I will not call you. If your son gets run over by a truck, I will not do that to myself.
So this is one of our important skills, which is to set limits.
Set limits. I started to get control of it, and I started to set limits. And this is something that everyone can do. We can set limits as to how much we're willing to be victimized and how much we're willing to tolerate. And I was not willing to tolerate that. Now, there is something very important in the way in which I did it, though. When we set limits, it's very important to make statements that begin with the pronoun I, to state what I am going to do, rather than you. Mm-hmm. So instead of saying to him, you're mean, you're unfair, or she's a witch, and you're not kind to me, I started every sentence with the pronoun I. This is the cornerstone to being assertive, to assertiveness training. And it's a little bit hard to learn because we are enculturated not to talk about ourselves. Mm-hmm. But in times like this, we make a string of I statements. I'm not willing to do it. I'm unwilling to accept this. And you must always ask for what you want. You don't assume that they'll read your mind. And I did say, I want you to find some other means of communication. I will not do this.
Begging and pleading, nagging and whining rarely, if ever, help us to achieve our objectives. While we often have very little control over what arouses our anger, we can sometimes set limits to some of the related circumstances. It is important to remember two things. First, when being assertive, it is much more effective to tell someone what we are going to do rather than what they ought to do. Therefore, speak in the first person. Make I statements rather than you, he, or she statements. Second, we should state specifically what we want as a resolution to our dilemma. It is not realistic to assume that others will read between the lines and automatically figure it out.
And Mary, now the next chapter is something that happened to you when you had a doctor's appointment.
Yes, and I like to tell this story. It's a simple story, and it illustrates a very important concept in dealing with anger. There were lots of things that happened in the whole divorce thing, but this one is very illustrative of a point I want to make. I went to visit our family doctor. I was going to be going to graduate school, and I had to have a physical examination. And I went there, and the exam was conducted, and when I left, I stopped at the desk where the receptionist was to pay the bill. And she said to me, oh, your husband was in here last week. Well, what was I going to say? You know, I said, oh, I hope he's okay. She said, well, I can't tell you about him. That's none of your business. Well, you know, I felt like I had been set up and then stabbed, you know. I thought, oh, I was very angry. And, you know, here she was, this young little girl, saying this to me. But what I did about that was, there are lots of doctors, and I never went